It started like every other suburban fairy tale, an idyllic little community tucked away behind ornate gates, its streets lined with imported maples and perfectly measured lawns. The neighborhood called itself Silvercrest Estates, though it was really just a small cluster of overambitious homes built on the side of a valley that had once been farmland. Developers had carved out the hills, shaped the slopes, and squeezed in a man-made lake at the bottom to make it all look exclusive. But what none of them realized, what would soon become painfully obvious, was that nature doesn't like to be told what to do. At the top edge of this engineered paradise sat one final property, slightly larger than the rest, older too. It wasn't part of the original Silvercrest design. The house stood on what used to be the upper pasture of the old farm that had existed before the subdivision, and behind it, nestled into a crease of earth and forest, sat a small private dam and pond, a relic of the land's original use. It was old but sturdy, built decades ago to water cattle and control runoff from the surrounding hills. When the developers built the new neighborhood below, they'd left it alone. They had no claim over it. The dam wasn't theirs. It belonged entirely to the man who owned that last property on the ridge. For years, the relationship between the homeowner and the Silvercrest Homeowners Association was awkward but civil. The HOA claimed jurisdiction over everything within its gates, but the ridge property technically sat just beyond. Still, the board didn't like the idea of someone outsider adjacent. They wanted conformity, matching mailboxes, coordinated paint colors, even approved flower species. From the start, the house on the ridge was a blemish to them, something they couldn't control but desperately wanted to. And then came the fees. At first, it was just petty letters slipped into the mailbox, reminders about community contributions and maintenance assessments. The owner ignored them. He wasn't part of Silvercrest, and he knew it. But the HOA's board, led by a newly elected and particularly ambitious president, didn't see it that way. To them, the dam and pond were part of the watershed infrastructure benefiting the neighborhood. They claimed it was unfair for the ridge property owner to have a body of water that aesthetically contributed to the community without paying dues. It was an absurd reach, but in the world of HOAs, absurdity often passes for law. The letters escalated. The HOA hired a law firm known for aggressive collection tactics. They began sending certified notices, threatening liens and fines. The homeowner filed responses explaining, politely at first, that his property predated Silvercrest's formation. He wasn't subject to their covenants, their bylaws, or their rules. The pond and the dam were entirely on his land, built decades before anyone in Silvercrest had even been born. But the board didn't care about history or property lines. They cared about control. Soon, whispers spread through the cul-de-sacs. The HOA told residents the man on the hill was freeloading, using their roads and drainage systems without paying. They said his dam was unsafe and that it posed a liability risk to everyone downhill. They even accused him of violating environmental codes, though, ironically, his dam was what prevented flooding in half their basements during storm season. The paranoia grew, and with it, the board's determination. By late spring, they had convinced themselves of a lie, that they had authority over that dam. The final straw came after a particularly wet season. Heavy rains filled the pond higher than usual, though it still remained well within safe limits. Photos of the rising water began circulating in the HOA Facebook group, captioned with phrases like, "This could break any day now," and "We need to do something." The president called an emergency meeting. Most residents didn't even attend. It wasn't their problem. But those who did voted unanimously for immediate action. In their minds, they were protecting their investment, their property values, their pristine lawns. What they actually voted for was destruction. The notice came in early June, taped crudely to the homeowner's gate. Failure to comply with HOA maintenance orders will result in enforcement actions. It cited unpaid fees, unauthorized water containment, and risk to community safety. There was no court order, no county inspection, just an HOA letterhead and a lot of audacity. A week later, on a hot and windless morning, a small crew arrived. The homeowner wasn't home. He had gone out of state for a few days. The crew, hired by the HOA, carried equipment: a small excavator, shovels, and a rented truck. The board president supervised from the edge of the driveway, clipboard in hand, confident in her righteousness. They cut through the wire fence surrounding the pond, ignoring the private property signs. They waded down to the dam's edge, pointing out what they thought were cracks. In reality, they were old drainage seams designed to relieve pressure. But no one there knew the first thing about dams. By noon, the excavator's bucket tore into the compacted earth. The first breach was small, just enough to let a trickle spill through. The water hissed down the slope, soaking the tall grass below. The president nodded approvingly. The crew kept digging. Within an hour, that trickle had become a stream. Then the stream became a torrent. By the time they realized what was happening, it was too late. The pond emptied faster than anyone expected. A wall of water surged down the hillside, carving a path straight toward the lower lots of Silvercrest. The HOA crew scrambled, shouting, trying to plug the breach with shovels and boards, but the pressure tore everything apart. The water ripped through the soil, snapping fence posts, uprooting small trees, and dragging chunks of the excavator downhill. Within minutes, the entire dam face collapsed in a roar of mud and debris. Below, the manicured streets of Silvercrest became rivers. Lawns turned into swamps. Decorative fountains overflowed with brown water. A few basements filled almost instantly. The HOA president stood frozen, her clipboard floating away at her feet. The liability risk she'd tried to eliminate had become a catastrophe, one entirely of her own making. The county emergency line lit up with calls. Neighbors screamed as their garages filled with muddy water. Cars parked in driveways started drifting down the road. The storm drains, already clogged from weeks of pollen and yard clippings, couldn't handle the flow. The pond's entire contents, tens of thousands of gallons, rushed downhill in less than 20 minutes, straight through the neighborhood the HOA had sworn to protect. When the homeowner returned 2 days later, the pond was gone. The dam gone. In its place was a jagged scar of earth leading into a drowned subdivision. County officials were everywhere, marking, measuring, photographing. The HOA president tried to explain what had happened, spinning the story as an emergency maintenance intervention. But no one was buying it. The truth was out, and the county's investigation had just begun. The ridge was quiet that evening. Eerily so. The homeowner stood at the edge of what used to be his pond, staring down at the devastation below. The sunset reflected off puddles where driveways used to be. It wasn't anger he felt, not yet, just disbelief. The HOA had destroyed his property, his land, and their own in one arrogant afternoon, and that was only the beginning. The morning after the flood, Silvercrest didn't look like a luxury neighborhood anymore. It looked like a disaster zone. The streets, once mirror-polished by obsessive homeowners, were coated in a thick layer of silt. Lawn ornaments leaned at odd angles. Mailboxes were half buried in mud. The air smelled of rot and fertilizer. And everywhere, there was silence. That stunned, post-chaos quiet when people are too shocked to speak. The HOA president had tried to control the story from the moment the water hit the first driveway. She told neighbors it was a natural overflow, that the ridge pond had finally given way under years of neglect. She framed herself as the hero who had taken action to prevent worse damage. For a brief moment, some even believed her. But that illusion didn't last long. The county inspectors arrived before noon. They came in pairs, one from the Environmental Division, one from Public Works. They didn't bother knocking on doors for gossip. They went straight to the source. When they found the collapsed dam, they immediately noticed the excavator tracks, the fresh gouges, the cut fence. They took pictures, lots of them. Then they followed the path of destruction downhill, documenting every broken retaining wall, every flooded basement. What they saw painted a very different picture from the HOA's story. By the end of the day, county officials had pieced together the basic timeline. The dam hadn't failed due to age or neglect. It had been breached deliberately. The marks were too clean, the equipment too modern. The cuts in the earth had the distinct shape of an excavator bucket, not erosion. Someone had dug into that dam on purpose. And since no permits had been filed, no county engineer consulted, the entire operation was illegal from the first shovelful. When the homeowner returned, his driveway was blocked off with caution tape. His property was now considered part of an active investigation. He stood quietly as the county officer explained the situation. There had been unauthorized alteration of water infrastructure, violation of property boundaries, and reckless endangerment of downstream residents. Words like felony and civil liability floated through the air like smoke. And though he hadn't yet said a word, everyone could feel the question building behind his silence. Who did this? Downhill, the HOA scrambled. The president called for an emergency board meeting in the clubhouse, though clubhouse was a generous term for the small stucco building that now smelled faintly of pond water. Only 3 of the 7 board members showed up in person. The others claimed flood-related issues. Still, the president tried to sound confident. She assured everyone that their intervention had been justified under community safety regulations. She waved around printed emails that supposedly proved they had authority. But the other members looked uneasy. Even they could see that the situation had spun far beyond HOA business. They weren't dealing with unpaid dues anymore. They were staring down potential lawsuits. Or worse. Meanwhile, the homeowner met with the county investigators again the following morning. He brought with him a binder, old property deeds, topographical maps, and county survey documents dating back 50 years. Every page told the same story. The dam was legally his, built long before Silvercrest existed. It had passed inspection after inspection. It wasn't just private property. It was protected by water management laws. That binder became the nail in the HOA's coffin. The county issued a formal statement by the end of the week. Their conclusion was clear. The dam failure had not been an act of nature. It had been human-caused destruction. They recommended a full legal review and referred the case to both the Sheriff's Department and the State Environmental Agency. Within hours, the local news caught wind of the story. Headlines hit the internet like sparks on dry grass. HOA destroys private dam, causes massive flood. Neighborhood Association under. Investigation after property. Damage. Silvercrest Estates. The HOA that sank. Itself. The residents didn't know what to do. Some tried to distance themselves from the board, claiming they had no idea what the president was planning. Others turned on her completely, demanding her resignation. She refused, of course. She called the coverage fake news and insisted the dam owner was just trying to cash in. But as the weeks went on and the cleanup bills stacked higher, the community's patience wore thin. The insurance companies weren't covering the damages. Not when the flooding was linked to an illegal demolition. Every homeowner was now staring at tens of thousands of dollars in repairs. And then came the lawsuits. The homeowner filed first. A civil suit naming the HOA, its president, and the contractor who had performed the breach. The claim was brutal. Destruction of property, negligence, trespassing, and willful endangerment. The county backed him up with environmental violations. The contractor, terrified, turned over every email, every text message, every instruction he'd received from the HOA president. His statement confirmed what the investigators had already suspected. The board had hired him without permits, without inspection, and under false claims of authorized maintenance. It wasn't just arrogance. It was criminal. As summer deepened, Silvercrest changed. The grass grew wild. The once perfect lawns turned patchy. The decorative pond at the center of the neighborhood was still half full of mud. The HOA stopped enforcing most of its rules because it couldn't afford to. The legal fees alone drained the association's reserves. Vendors stopped returning their calls. Residents stopped paying their dues, claiming they didn't trust the board anymore. In a matter of months, the pristine image of Silvercrest Estates began to crumble. For the homeowner, it was strange to watch. He hadn't sought revenge. He hadn't needed to. Nature and bureaucracy were doing the work for him. Each rainstorm carved the collapsed slope a little deeper, sending fresh streams of sediment across the neighborhood roads. The county had issued a stop work order preventing anyone from touching the area until the lawsuits were resolved, so no one could rebuild the dam or regrade the hillside. The once beautiful valley below had become a scar, a daily reminder of what the HOA's pride had cost them. The president, once the most feared woman on the block, now avoided leaving her house. Neighbors crossed the street to avoid her. Her pristine garden was dying under a film of silt. Her mailbox leaned crooked, still caked with dried mud. She had started receiving letters, not from the HOA this time, but from attorneys. Her leadership had become evidence. When the first court summons arrived, the tone of the entire neighborhood shifted. The HOA tried to settle privately, offering the homeowner a small payout and a public apology. He declined both. He wanted the truth on record. Every permit ignored, every warning dismissed, every arrogant decision that led to that flood. He wanted it documented that the dam had held for 50 years until the HOA destroyed it. And he wanted everyone to see the irony. In their attempt to assert power, they had literally sunk themselves. The county eventually classified the area below the dam as unstable land. Several houses were now at permanent risk of foundation damage. Home values plummeted almost overnight. Realtors stopped showing the neighborhood. The gates that once represented exclusivity now felt like a prison fence around a mistake. By early autumn, Silvercrest had become a ghost of its former self, quiet, broken, and drowning in paperwork. The court dates were set. The investigations were still ongoing, and the residents had started whispering about disbanding the HOA entirely. But that decision, like everything else in Silvercrest, would not come without consequences. Because, as it turned out, the flood had revealed something else buried beneath the surface, something even the homeowner didn't know about. And that discovery would change everything. In the weeks following the flood, Silvercrest Estates became a neighborhood frozen in a kind of suspended disbelief. Cleanup crews worked tirelessly, but no amount of silt removal or debris hauling could restore the illusion of order. Nature, once merely a backdrop to manicured lawns and synthetic perfection, had claimed the streets, and under the murky puddles and mud-caked driveways, secrets began to surface. Secrets that the HOA, in all its hubris, could never have anticipated. It started subtly. A homeowner digging a trench to repair a damaged sprinkler system noticed something strange in the mud. A piece of wood, long and weathered, jutting from the soft earth. At first, they assumed it was old fencing or construction debris from the initial subdivision project. But as more rain fell, more of these objects began to appear, strewn across multiple properties. Old planks, rusted metal, and chunks of what seemed like foundation beams. The water, in its relentless movement, had peeled back layers of earth that had been untouched for decades, revealing that Silvercrest had been built on land with a complicated history. A history no one had bothered to investigate before erecting their perfect houses. The homeowner on the ridge, the man whose dam had been destroyed, was the first to notice the pattern. Maps he had tucked away in dusty drawers, Historical topographical surveys and county records all hinted at something he hadn't fully understood when he moved in. The hillside wasn't just farmland. Beneath the soil lay remnants of the original settlement, foundations of old barns, drainage canals, and even a network of small tunnels that appeared to have been used for irrigation or storage. The ridge pond had been built on this system, carefully engineered decades before, and it had protected the land below by stabilizing the water flow. The HOA, in its rush to destroy it, had triggered a chain reaction the moment the dam was breached. Over the next few days, the damage revealed more than just old construction remnants. In a low-lying backyard where a luxury pool had once gleamed, workers discovered a large underground cavity. The soil around it had eroded so rapidly after the dam's collapse that it formed a natural sinkhole. County engineers arrived and confirmed their suspicions. The ground had been saturated for decades by controlled pond water, and now that water had been unleashed, the soil had no structural integrity. A few more holes like this could destabilize entire foundations. By midweek, the homeowner had begun walking the hills at dawn, notebook in hand, charting every new revelation. His dam might have been gone, but he understood the forces he had once harnessed. Each piece of exposed wood, each eroded trench, each cavity told a story of water management, human oversight, and the delicate balance between land and habitation. And as he walked, he realized something horrifying. The HOA had not only destroyed his property, but had destabilized the entire neighborhood in a way no one had anticipated. The rumors began almost immediately. A neighbor reported a crack in the foundation that zigzagged across her living room floor. Another noticed the back corner of their garage slowly sinking into mud. By the end of the week, Silvercrest Estates had multiple emergency notices posted, warning homeowners to stay out of certain areas, to avoid basements, to evacuate if necessary. It was no longer just a legal or financial problem. It was a physical threat. Amid this chaos, the HOA president remained defiant, though her influence was waning. She attempted to spin the narrative once again, claiming that the flooding had revealed pre-existing conditions, that the neighborhood's infrastructure was inherently weak, and that no one could have foreseen this. Her statements were thin, almost desperate. Local reporters, once fascinated by the drama, were now camped outside her house. She had become the face of failure, an embodiment of arrogance meeting the laws of nature. Social media turned merciless, each post a viral indictment. HOA destroys dam. Entire neighborhood at risk. Homeowners warning ignored. Disaster guaranteed. The homeowner stayed largely out of the spotlight, choosing observation over confrontation. But even he couldn't ignore the consequences. Families were moving out. Real estate agents refused to sell in the area. Homes that had been valued near 7 figures were now being assessed for tens of thousands in damage mitigation. Insurance companies were reviewing policies, hesitant to cover a neighborhood now officially classified as unstable. The HOA had not only destroyed the pond, they had unleashed a long-suppressed chain of events that threatened to erase the very foundation of their meticulously curated community. And then, in an ironic twist, the water itself revealed the most shocking secret. As rain continued to wash debris down the hillside, it uncovered a large concrete structure buried just beneath the slope the dam had once held back. It was old, moss-covered, and partially collapsed, but unmistakably man-made. County engineers descended with caution, measuring and inspecting. Preliminary reports suggested it was part of an old reservoir system, possibly built in the early 20th century. Its intended function had been water storage and controlled release, essentially a backup for the pond that had now been obliterated. But because no one had maintained it in decades, the floodwater had weakened the surrounding soil, turning it into a trapdoor of instability. One wrong step could have swallowed an entire car. This revelation sparked panic among the residents and the media alike. The homeowner on the ridge, who had long warned of the risks, now had evidence to support every claim he had made. The HOA, in their ignorance and greed, had treated a delicate ecosystem like a sandbox, digging and destroying without understanding the consequences. And now the neighborhood itself was paying the price. Engineers and inspectors recommended immediate action. No construction, no landscaping, no heavy equipment. Emergency stabilization work was necessary to prevent further sinkholes and potential collapses. Yet with each passing day, new hazards appeared. Small landslides slid silently down the slope, uprooting trees, crushing flower beds, and opening fissures in sidewalks. The local government began considering zoning interventions, perhaps even mandating the demolition of houses deemed unsafe. The very fabric of Silvercrest Estates was unraveling. Amid this growing disaster, the HOA's credibility disintegrated completely. Their attempts at controlling the narrative were futile. Emails leaked, showing the president had known of potential risks, but had ignored warnings to protect the community's aesthetic and collect dues. The board members who had quietly disagreed were now forced to testify under oath, revealing internal memos that highlighted their neglect and arrogance. Social media users tracked the unfolding events like a serialized drama, hashtags spreading rapidly. Silvercrest flood, HOA fails, dam destroyed neighborhood sinks. The story was no longer just local, it was viral. And yet, despite all the chaos, one thing was clear. The homeowner's warnings had been prophetic. He had not acted out of malice or revenge. He had merely understood the land he lived on, the delicate balance of water and soil, and the foolishness of attempting to control nature with ego instead of knowledge. Every crack in a foundation, every displaced lawn ornament, every sinkhole now bore witness to a truth that the HOA had refused to see. When you mess with forces you do not understand, they eventually fight back. By the end of Chapter 3, Silvercrest Estates was a neighborhood divided, unstable, and haunted by water. The flood had exposed not only the physical vulnerabilities of the land, but the moral failings of those in charge. And as engineers, media, and desperate homeowners combed through the ruins, an uncomfortable question loomed over the entire community. Had the HOA's arrogance created irreversible damage, or was there still a chance to salvage what remained? One thing was certain. The water had revealed far more than anyone expected, and the truth it uncovered would set the stage for consequences that no resident of Silvercrest Estates could ignore. The weeks following the revelations were merciless. Silvercrest Estates had transformed from a picture-perfect neighborhood into a cautionary tale. Streets that once glittered with freshly edged lawns and painted curbs now resembled construction zones strewn with mud, debris, and collapsed landscaping. The HOA, which had once held the illusion of control, now resembled a rudderless ship caught in a storm, and its president had become the subject of viral ridicule and legal scrutiny. The first shock came in the form of county subpoenas. Investigators wanted every record, every communication, every invoice connected to the breach of the dam. Emails, text messages, and board meeting notes were demanded. Even private messages on social media were subject to review. The HOA had underestimated the thoroughness of official scrutiny. In trying to enforce unpaid fees and assert dominance over a property they did not legally control, they had left a digital trail of reckless decision-making. When the subpoenas arrived, the board members were blindsided. Some claimed ignorance, some denied involvement, and others quietly disappeared from the public eye. But the documents told a different story. The HOA president's directives were explicit: demolish the dam to protect the community and ensure the homeowner paid. Contractors were given permission to act without permits. Warnings from engineers and previous homeowner correspondents were ignored. Every negligent step had been documented. Local news outlets had a field day. The story went viral in ways the residents could barely comprehend. Video clips of flooding streets, floating cars, and demolished lawns were shared with captions dripping in sarcasm and outrage. HOA plays God. Neighborhood drowns. Meet the HOA that destroyed its own homes. From pristine to mud. Silvercrest's fall. Residents watched the footage. Stunned, their humiliation compounded by the knowledge that it wasn't natural disaster, but human hubris that had caused the chaos. The homeowner on the ridge, meanwhile, became an unlikely symbol of reason and foresight. Unlike the frenzied HOA, he stayed calm, documenting every new landslide, every eroded slope, and every cracked foundation. He compiled photographs, historical records, and engineering reports into a meticulous dossier. It wasn't just for legal proceedings. It was for posterity. Every detail recorded the catastrophe that the HOA had unleashed. His calm, methodical approach made him appear almost prophetic, someone who had seen disaster coming and simply prepared for it. By mid-autumn, the lawsuits were underway. The homeowner filed a civil suit against the HOA and its president for property destruction, trespass, negligence, and willful endangerment. The case quickly gained traction. The HOA's insurance tried to intervene, but because the destruction was intentional and illegal, their liability coverage was limited. The board members individually faced potential civil and criminal liability. For the first time, the power dynamic in Silvercrest had shifted dramatically. The community that once feared the HOA now watched as its leadership faltered under scrutiny. Meanwhile, residents were forced to confront the stark reality of the damage. Homes were condemned or classified as unsafe due to soil instability. Driveways were sunken, fences destroyed, and basements irreparably flooded. Cleanup crews had patched the worst of the damage, but nature was still taking its toll. Storms, once minor nuisances, now caused minor landslides and localized flooding. The HOA's insistence on aesthetics over safety had left the entire neighborhood vulnerable. Public perception turned brutal. Social media amplified the narrative. Neighbors shared drone footage showing the scale of the disaster. Viral threads chronicled the day the HOA sank the neighborhood, comparing old photos of manicured lawns with current scenes of devastation. Even small local publications picked up the story, framing it as an epic cautionary tale about unchecked authority and the dangers of authoritarian homeowners associations. The HOA president, once the unquestioned ruler of Silvercrest, was now widely mocked and vilified. In the midst of all this, the homeowner remained eerily quiet. He didn't gloat. He didn't post videos or make statements. Instead, he continued observing the land, noting each new crack, each sinkhole, each precarious slope. Engineers leaned heavily on his historical knowledge of the pond and dam, seeking insight into soil composition, water retention, and potential hazard zones. While the HOA had acted in ignorance, he acted with knowledge. The contrast between the two could not have been starker. As the legal case moved forward, more shocking details emerged. The county's investigation uncovered environmental violations the HOA had ignored. The dam had not only prevented flooding, but had maintained groundwater levels critical to hillside stability. By breaching it, the HOA had disrupted the local hydrology, potentially destabilizing the slopes for years. Experts warned that rebuilding or repairing homes without professional oversight could trigger additional landslides. The HOA's initial quick fix had created a problem far larger than anyone anticipated. Residents were forced into difficult choices. Some attempted temporary repairs, boarding up windows and reinforcing soil, but many realized their investments were compromised. Real estate agents refused to list properties, citing risk assessments and instability. Families that had once considered Silvercrest a safe haven began moving out, leaving houses vacant and lawns untended. The neighborhood's social fabric, once tightly knit through HOA regulation and conformity, began to unravel. Meanwhile, The HOA president doubled down on her narrative. In interviews, she claimed she acted in good faith, insisting that she had no idea the destruction would cause such catastrophic effects. But emails, contracts, and contractor testimony painted a different picture. She knew the dam was critical to the land below. She ignored warnings. She authorized illegal demolition. She prioritized image and fees over safety. Her credibility was collapsing faster than the sidewalks of Silvercrest. By the end of the chapter, the courtroom drama loomed. Experts prepared reports detailing structural instability, environmental disruption, and liability. Attorneys for the homeowner compiled evidence showing deliberate negligence and reckless endangerment. Social media followers tracked every twist and turn, turning the HOA's failure into an ongoing spectacle. And while Silvercrest Estates tried to recover from the initial flood, the neighborhood itself remained physically and psychologically scarred. The stage was set for the final confrontation. The HOA had misjudged the homeowner, misjudged the land, and misjudged nature itself. In their pursuit of authority and control, they had unleashed forces far beyond their understanding. Every misstep had compounded the last, and now the reckoning they had ignored was finally arriving. For the homeowner on the ridge, the wait was almost over. The law, the media, and the land itself were aligned in his favor. The neighborhood that had mocked him, tried to control him, and destroyed his property was about to face consequences on a scale the HOA could never have imagined. And yet, just as the residents began to think they understood the full extent of the disaster, the land revealed another, even more terrifying truth. One that no engineer, lawyer, or viral news outlet had predicted. By the time late autumn arrived, Silvercrest Estates had become a cautionary tale, written in mud, concrete, and despair. Streets were no longer straight lines of asphalt and pristine sidewalks. They were rivers of silt, interrupted by sinkholes and jagged debris. Homes leaned precariously against eroded soil, some condemned, some teetering on the edge of instability. The carefully curated appearance of the neighborhood was gone, replaced by an unrelenting reminder of one truth. The HOA's arrogance had unleashed a disaster they could never contain. The courtroom was packed for the civil trial. Cameras perched on tripods captured every angle, and reporters scribbled furiously, tweeting updates in real time. The homeowner on the ridge entered calmly, carrying a binder thicker than a phone book, filled with historical maps, engineering reports, photographs, and correspondence documenting the HOA's reckless actions. The HOA president sat across from him, flanked by a dwindling number of board members and their legal team, their faces pale and stiff. The air was electric with anticipation, a mix of satisfaction, dread, and schadenfreude that could be felt even in the back row. The homeowner's case was methodical. Each step of the HOA's negligence was laid bare. They had knowingly authorized the breach of a private dam without permits. They ignored warnings from engineers and environmental experts. They misrepresented authority over property they did not own. The destruction was not accidental. It was willful, calculated, and catastrophic. The evidence was overwhelming. Photos of flooding streets, ruined lawns, and sinking foundations were displayed on large monitors for all to see. Drone footage showed the once pristine neighborhood now resembling a half-submerged ghost town. Residents of Silvercrest, some still living in compromised homes, attended the trial. Their expressions ranged from disbelief to grim satisfaction. Many had lost significant portions of their property value, but the courtroom offered the first glimpse of justice in months. For years, they had tolerated an HOA that acted like a miniature government, enforcing arbitrary rules, micromanaging lawns, and demanding fees. Now, the very organization that had promised order was on trial for chaos. Meanwhile, engineers testified about the land itself. The pond had been a stabilizing force, controlling runoff and maintaining soil integrity across the ridge and hillside. The HOA's demolition had released pent-up water, destabilizing previously sound soil, and triggering a cascade of erosion. Sinkholes, fissures, and minor landslides were direct consequences of their actions. Some areas were deemed permanently uninhabitable. The testimony was clear. The HOA had not only destroyed the homeowner's property, but had destabilized an entire neighborhood. As the trial unfolded, the media coverage intensified. Local news outlets ran live segments. Social media exploded with hashtags like Cedar HOA Chaos, China Silvercrest Disaster, and Ein Neighborhood Sinks. Drone footage, photographs, and maps circulated widely. YouTube channels chronicled every development, editing together dramatic music, slow-motion shots of flooded streets, and sarcastic commentary about HOA hubris. The narrative was no longer just a legal battle. It had become a cultural moment, a viral example of what happens when authority is unchecked, arrogant, and ignorant of nature. The HOA president attempted a defense, claiming she acted in good faith to protect the community. She insisted the homeowner's dam was somehow an ongoing hazard and argued that residents had been at risk regardless. But emails, text messages, and contractor testimony under oath told a different story. Her instructions were explicit: destroy the dam, bypass permits, enforce fees. Every claim of good faith collapsed under the weight of evidence. By mid-trial, the jury had seen everything: the before and after photographs, the engineering reports, the documented warnings ignored, and the cascading consequences of their actions. The homeowner did not need to embellish the story. The evidence told the story of arrogance, negligence, and sheer folly. Outside the courthouse, Silvercrest Estates continued to decay. Streets were closed due to instability. Parks were cordoned off. Landscaping companies refused to work in areas deemed hazardous. Residents who had not yet moved lived with constant anxiety. The memory of the flood fresh in their minds, the ever-present risk of further collapse looming. The once celebrated aesthetic harmony of the neighborhood had been replaced by fear and frustration. Then, after weeks of testimony, deliberation, and mounting public pressure, the verdict arrived. The jury ruled unanimously in favor of the homeowner. The HOA was found liable for property destruction, negligence, trespass, and environmental damage. The president and board members faced significant financial penalties personally, as insurance coverage had limited protection for illegal and willful acts. The verdict was historic. A neighborhood association held accountable for direct, deliberate damage to private and communal property. The public reaction was immediate and viral. News outlets hailed the homeowner as a symbol of vigilance and foresight, the HOA as a cautionary tale of arrogance. Videos chronicling the events racked up millions of views. Social media posts mocked the president, analyzed her decisions, and debated how an HOA could ever justify acting with such reckless disregard. In forums, hashtags trended for days. The story was no longer about Silvercrest Estates alone. It was about accountability, unchecked authority, and the consequences of ignoring both law and nature. For the homeowner, the outcome was more than financial restitution. It was vindication. The dam he had built and maintained for decades had not only protected the hillside, but had become a symbol of foresight, knowledge, and prudence. The court's decision acknowledged that his property, his care, and his understanding of the land had been ignored, mocked, and violated. Now, justice had been served. In the neighborhood, the fallout continued. Some residents began repairs where feasible. Others sold and moved away. The HOA was effectively dissolved, its board members discredited, and its bylaws under scrutiny. The gates of Silvercrest, once symbols of control, now stood as monuments to failure and hubris. Nature, unchecked by arrogance, had reclaimed its authority. And the ridge pond? Though the original structure was gone, its absence remained a reminder. The water it once contained had flowed freely, uncovering truths about the land and the people who had tried to dominate it. Even in its absence, it continued to influence events, stabilizing some slopes naturally, eroding others, and serving as a silent witness to the folly of human pride. As the sun set over Silvercrest Estates, the neighborhood looked very different from its planned perfection. Streets were scarred, lawns uneven, trees bent or uprooted. Yet there was also a strange beauty in the chaos, a reminder that nature could neither be bought nor bullied. The homeowner walked along the ridge, surveying the remains of the dam, the flowing streams, and the affected homes below. For the first time since the flood, he felt a sense of closure. The neighborhood had sunk, but not under his actions. It had sunk under arrogance, greed, and ignorance. And in that reckoning, justice had finally flowed freely. Silvercrest Estates would never be the same. Its story would be retold for years, a viral warning to every HOA and property manager who ever imagined they could control the land and people without consequence. The homeowner had endured, the neighborhood had suffered, and the water, patient, relentless, unstoppable, had reminded everyone that no one, not even a self-righteous HOA, could outrun the laws of nature. And so, the tale of the pond that protected, the HOA that destroyed, and the neighborhood that sank came to a close, not with chaos, but with clarity. Justice had arrived. The lesson had been carved into the earth, and Silvercrest Estates would never forget.